about 2 or 3 things, and then just open up the questions, because that's normally what we do with these. So first is on calendar. We received about 5,000 responses to the calendar survey we sent out. Now that may be a little misleading, because in the middle of it, the New York Times picked up the fact that we were doing this calendar survey, and there was an article in the New York Times about it, and they actually published the site. So I don't know how many people from outside Brookline who wanted to influence our survey decided to, do that. But we had over 5,000 responses. So and so people said a couple things in those data. One was that the preference was that if we did anything to make up future snow days, which we're not going to have, I've told senior staff and principals a number of times, that they'd want us to start with Good Friday. That was a pretty overwhelming choice. Second choice was that they'd want us to add an hour to the day, which I think I tried to explain to people I don't actually have the authority to do. The commissioner has not given us the authority to waive the 180-day requirement. So adding time wouldn't make up days. And then go to Saturday, and Saturdays and April vacation were considerably down the list. The other kind of interesting thing about the survey is about 70% of people, and this was staff and parents, right, said, and it was pretty consistent between the two groups, said that they would like us, if we could, to use some strategies to finish earlier than the 26th. And so I have to tell you, I'm a little worried about the response to that question, because it's such a general question, right? Of course I would like you to finish earlier than the 26th, right? But if I told you that the way we would have to do that is to find 5 days to get back to the 19th, for example, and that would mean Good Friday, 4 Saturdays, 2 days from April vacation and 2 Saturdays, or something like that, you'd probably say absolutely not, don't do that, don't even think about it. So I question the results of that particular question. So right now we're staying with the 26th. That'll be the last day, and we're not going to have any more snow, so that will be the last day. And I've said to principals, we'll work at this, I think, in 2 weeks on 8th grade graduations, but they won't be before the 22nd, which is the beginning of that week. And there's a very simple explanation to that, which is that actually I don't have the authority to let 8th graders finish before the 180th day anyhow. We've always done it. We've actually moved it closer to the end of the year over time, but I don't actually have that authority, right? And so most places that you go, you'll find if they have 8th grade ceremonies or 5th grade ceremonies if they have elementary schools, they do it on the 180th day. There's a reason for that. It's the law. Right? And so we've always done this a little bit sooner, but I really can't move it any sooner than earlier that week. So later, in 2 weeks, I'll actually give them the specific parameters, but they'll be on probably most principals, if we stick with this schedule, will be on the 22nd or 23rd, somewhere in that neighborhood. I know that causes issues for people, and I'm sorry about that. We are trying to do some work with the longer term calendar. I mean, one overwhelming comment in the surveys was, start before Labor Day, and thank you for saying that, because we are. Now next year, we actually are doing 2 student days and 2 staff days all before Labor Day. 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th. Before we get to Labor Day, we already have 4 days in. In the future, we've negotiated a contract with the teachers that always allows us to do our teacher days before Labor Day, so that we can always start students on the Tuesday right after. That picks up a number of days for us, will get us done earlier in the year. There are some districts out there talking about some really wacky things. My wife works in Salem. They're having school April vacation this year. They've scheduled Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of April vacation. I don't know if they actually think anyone's coming, but they're actually going to have school on April vacation. Other districts are talking about getting rid of all their religious holidays. That's been a battle. You may have read that in the newspaper in some districts, all caused by this really severe winter, where some districts, I mean, we've had 6 snow days, some are up to 10, 11 snow days this year, and they're trying to deal with that. So that's first. Second, I know it's less of an issue here, but it is an issue in terms of space. So we discussed some short-term and long-term kinds of space issues. I mean, because it's part of the questions that are on the ballot on May 5th, the devotion school project is moving forward. The financing of that, how that would be financed, is part of one of those questions, debt exclusion question. But we have some short-term pieces to work out as to how we get the devotion project done, right? Where are the kids during that project? So some of you know that next year we'll actually move the 7th and 8th grade out of devotion to the old Lincoln School. The following year, the 5th and 6th grade, that's when the construction project begins. The following year, the 5th and 6th grade will join them. 5th through 8th grade will be housed there for the length of that construction project. Right now, we're in the process of trying to move K through 4 as well. Because if we move K through 4, we not only save money on the project, but we save a year. It takes a year less to do the project without anyone on the grounds. Why is that important? This is the part that's important to you, because we need the space for the high school, right? We know that in 2019, we're pushed on our high school enrollment and the size of the present facility. All of the plans we're making and looking at, options we're looking at for what we'll do at the high school are going to be finished after 2019. So we need short-term space, and that's the old Lincoln School. And so we need to get devotion finished so that we have the old Lincoln School available for the high school, because it's about that time that we're into the 2,100 range. On our way by 2022 to over 2,600 students of high school age in this town. Presently, we're about 1,900 students at the high school. So that's why devotion is important to you, because it impacts the high school. We have a lot of short-term pieces that, again, you hear about, I'm sure, because of people in the neighborhood. Baker School is an issue. We're out of space there now. Hancock Village yet to come. And we're actually, it looks like now we're on track to put modulars in for next year, a few modulars to be able to accommodate that population for 1 year. At one point, we were looking at whether we were going to actually have to move a Baker class to the Heath School. And that's probably not going to happen now. That will make our early education parents happy when I meet with them on Thursday night, because it would have meant moving an early education class out of there. And Pierce School is out of room, and we're actually looking now at renting more space. Some of you know, as you follow this stuff, that we're at about $500,000 a year in rental space for early education programs. And we're going to have to rent more. We're looking at some buildings, a building in particular, very close to the Pierce School that has a for rent sign on it. Okay? We're still negotiating, so I won't identify the building, but you could probably figure it out pretty easily. And we're looking at that for space for 7th and 8th grade, and to create space for that school because it's growing so fast. It's probably the school where we've seen the enrollment hit the hardest over the last few years in particular. We topped 700 kindergartners, yay, for this year. We're over 700, yay us. And we're going to start looking at next year's kindergarten numbers next week. Normally we would have looked at them by now, but our February was so bad in terms of our kindergarten registration dates. 6 of our 16 got canceled, that we actually haven't paid much attention to those numbers to date. And we've actually been registering people. Come over to our offices now, you'll see a steady line of people registering for kindergarten in our Office of Student Affairs. So those are the people that missed the February date, probably because of weather, and are now in registering, and we're catching up. So we should have those basic numbers, but there's nothing new in those numbers. People who think the bottom is going to fall out of this enrollment trend at some point, there's nothing new in those numbers. They're high. They're trending toward at least, we think, the 650 range, which is our new base of prediction. We've actually exceeded that 2 of the last 3 years. They're high. And they tend to be highest at a place like Pierce. Again, they're very high. So that's second issue. And the third is just budget, which we put out last week in a very lengthy budget message. 24 pages if you want to read it, that really had to describe 2 different scenarios, right? Because we've been charged with presenting 2 different scenarios this year. So one is a base, as Mr. Rowe calls it, base budget, which is a no override assumption that assumes we have the normal revenues that come through the state budget, normal revenues that come from local receipts, that come through our own generation of revenues, and what would happen under that scenario, what would we be able to fund, what would we be able to do. And the second of which is I'll just say a more visionary budget that says all of the issues that we've been talking about at forums like this, all of the things that we've been talking with school committee, board of selectmen, override committee, advisory committee for the last number of years about what it is we're trying to accomplish for kids here, and how would we start to go about that. And we've actually laid out a longer term plan around those pieces as well. We actually laid out a budget plan that took us through 2022. I have colleagues who say I'm crazy for having laid out a budget through 2022, but we did, because people said, what is it you're trying to achieve? Where is it you've fallen behind? What are you trying to do here that you can't do now because you've had to focus almost exclusively on the classroom, right? And so there are a couple key pieces of that I'll just highlight here, and then I'm happy to go into the two scenarios if you want, or if you want to talk about something other than budget, that would be thrilling as well. I mean, I think we've said we've focused on the classroom, and a lot of things around the classroom have suffered as a result of that. The good news is our class sizes are within about 1.5 students of where they were when this whole enrollment growth began. Now, some of you will say, yeah, but there are larger class sizes in that. That's true. I'm talking about average, and range has clearly grown. There are more examples of 24s and 25s, even in primary grades, than there were 8 years ago. But we have focused on that piece. So what's happened as a result? Well, our efforts around making sure that we meet the needs of every child have suffered, quite frankly. And that gets played out in some recommendations that are in this report that we're particularly proud about the work that's going on in the ECS program review, which I would say isn't as focused around what people might traditionally call gifted and talented as it is around meeting the needs of every child. So we've actually used what's referred to in our lingo as a response to intervention model, which says if a teacher or a parent believe there are concerns around child's needs being met, they can come to a child study team. Some of you have been through special ed, and you know what that looks like. And they can look for additional help there, the teacher can, as to strategies that can be used in the classroom, or whether the needs that might be in place actually go beyond the classroom. And there might be other activities outside of the classroom, or that's level 2. So level 1 is in the classroom. Level 2 are those things outside of the classroom. And level 3 are those strategies like grade acceleration and subject area acceleration. And we actually believe that that's a great driving force in our work with teachers around the differentiation that they do for students. So we don't view it as a strict, yep, this is an ECS model and it's about identifying kids. We believe it's a professional development strategy to improve the situation for all kids and all teachers. The second area that we've really tried to focus on is the way we equip our classroom, right, in terms of the technology that's available for kids. Now, I'll go back to that first piece and say, I can't do the kind of differentiation I want to do without being able to have avenues available for teachers and principals that allow them to go outside of the school and outside of the classroom without adding bodies. And in many districts, they're able to do that through distance learning opportunities or through learning opportunities of something that exists in one building in this district that doesn't exist in another, and being able to access that. I have a colleague in Paradise Valley, Arizona, where their entire gifted and talented program is not the entire program, but a large part of that program is based on their ability to connect people across their schools. Huge school district. And they can connect people across those schools, because otherwise they couldn't staff it. It would be impossible. So we have what some people have said is an aggressive technology plan. I actually believe it's a wiring plan. I mean, there's nothing, as I said to the school committee last week, there's nothing terribly sexy in our technology plan. It quite frankly is about providing each classroom with the tools and providing parents and our teachers with the tools that they need in order to communicate and in order to allow students to access that curriculum, right? So, for example, things like, what I mean by communication are things like a learning management system that allow you to communicate with us and allow teachers to do a better job beyond the high school, where some of this is happening now, at communicating expectations and sharing assignments and all of those kinds of things with kids. But in a district like ours, we have to make sure that all kids have access, because right now they don't. And so there's a pretty aggressive plan in there to make sure that all kids have access. So, you know, we end up, unfortunately, too often talking about, well, this budget adds 2.0 FTE to do X. Full-time equivalent, sorry. Right, it adds 2 staff members to do this. And what we get away from way too often is talking about what we're actually trying to accomplish. And I hope that gives you a couple of examples of the kinds of things that we're actually trying to accomplish with this spending plan. I'll give you a couple of other things that just speak to the changing nature of the system, right? That maybe don't apply here, but our system has changed. And so one major issue for us is around things like translation. I just got the data from our ELL coordinator yesterday. We have 400 students who started this year. I believe the number was 400 at the elementary, 425 at the elementary and high school level, who've not accessed education in the United States before this year. You know what? I said that last night and some people went, yeah, okay. I mean, that number's up though, and growing. And that causes changes in what we have to do to program for it, right? So you know that we centralized something like student affairs. We did that to take that responsibility away from buildings, because it was, what we were told is it was occupying a lot of time of office staff and principals, and we put it in one place. That's one reason we did it. The other was to create more consistent data. And the third was to make sure those people were provided with services, right? To make sure we got the ELL screening, that we started special education screening at those points, make sure we were able to do that. Anyhow, talk about any of that or all of that. Budget also calls for adding guidance and nurses and those kinds of positions, right? Because we know that those are the areas where we've fallen behind, where we haven't kept up. We have schools that are 800, and they have the same guidance staffing, the same nursing staffing as when they were 500. Okay. The other thing I should go back and double back on in terms of space is that you know, those are some of the short-term. Devotion's obviously a longer-term piece, and those and the pieces around Baker and Pierce, they're short-term space. We also have a consultant who's been charged by the school committee and the Board of Selectmen with trying to identify a place for a 9th school. And some people have said, is that a 9th elementary school, and or could that be something to help solve the high school problem? And the answer is yes. Yes, big broad yes, right? Because in the high school conversation so far, we've actually looked at what I characterize into 3 buckets, right? Is the long-term solution adding on to Brookline High School on the present campus? Somewhat difficult to do, right? 2,600 students on that campus, infrastructure being what it is, what we're trying to accomplish in terms of the educational program. We've started through an exercise with a consultant, and it's somewhat difficult to do. Are we talking about 2 high schools in the future of Brookline? Again, some people have very strong feelings about that. Or is it adding a building close enough to the present campus that allows us to target that space with some particular program? The school within a school program, something around STEM initiatives, science, technology, engineering, math, thank you, and integrated with the arts, right? So what is it? And we're not there yet. I wish we were. We're not. But there'll be some solution developed. So, you know, are there spaces that even fit any of those 3 buckets that these consultants can identify? And they're charged with coming back to us at some point here fairly soon. Let me do one more thing, then I'll be quiet and let you ask questions. 2. Yes, I have 2 school committee members here. You should also know Susan Wolf-Ditkoff, who's the chair of the school committee, and Abby Cox, a member of the school committee, are also here with us this morning. What do you want to talk about? Yes.
So I have a more mundane question. My name is Susan Gold. My daughter's a 6th grader, and she's in need from the get-go. And I'm a newer member of the school council, so I've had the opportunity to learn from Dr. Machine and learn a lot about our needs here at Runkle. And one of the things that I have to say that was surprised me was how small our budget is locally and how much is centralized with Brookline, which
Yep.
makes a lot of sense. But one of the questions...
Maybe.
Maybe, that's right. We have some pressing needs here, and one of the things Dr. Boucher has been educating us about is this shift from teaching staff development and shifting from total intervention to tooling the teachers to do more intervention with students at the classroom level. But it seems that there's a gap in like literacy specialists and math specialists here. I know there's been some requests that we've made for that. And I'm wondering where we are with that and what do we need to do? Because I think there is a gap in the need at Runkle for more resource on that. And I don't know if that's part of the override budget that we will actually get those resources if in hopes the override will pass. But if you could educate us and kind of fill us in on how we fill that need.
I didn't write that question. But I really appreciate that question. I appreciate the nodding of heads over there too. So a couple things on that. Thank you for that. So first of all, I'm not sure about the centralization of resources. I mean, I have some concerns, have historically had some concerns about that in terms of professional development dollars, right, being sent, and other dollars being centralized. It's a historical model here in Brookline. I will say I've been here 11 years. I've discovered that it's not the easiest thing to break out, right? But we actually have done pieces of it over the last couple of years. They're small, they're too small. And in this spending plan, we actually do more. I'll give you two examples. We had from the beginning in our discussions with school committee, board of selectmen, override study committee, we had targeted additional dollars for professional learning in this spending plan. And in fact, as we've built them into this budget, we've driven them to the building level. So it's $100,000 that we drive straight to the building level under the control of principals around their school improvement plans. So that's first. Second, we've targeted an amount of money in terms of, because we have a wonderful before and after school program review report from a number of years ago that quite frankly we've not done much with. So we've targeted an amount of money, I think it's in the neighborhood of $50,000, and we've driven that to principals to do that same kind of thing, because I believe, we're seriously lacking, particularly at middle level, in terms of some of those before and after school activities. And I know you're trying to get something started now that we're actually trying to figure out if we can fund even for this year. But that budget does include funds to drive for those kinds of things, all under the message of we want to put more dollars in the hands of principals with accountability for results, but we want to put more dollars in the hands of principals. In terms of the other areas you've talked about, yes, those budgets do fund what's been referred to over time as the catch-up, right, particularly in those areas. I mean, I prefer to talk about it as enrollment-driven. There's enrollment, which has always been characterized as the classroom. I think enrollment-driven is where we've not been able to keep up with in literacy specialists, math specialists, those areas, and the override spending plan does do that. It's targeted. It's around specific programming and specific goals. I actually believe that those two, at least one of those areas, the literacy area, and another piece that we've built in, which largely targets occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech, but not in special education, more in a response to intervention mode for kids in regular education, in general education, are preventative services in nature and actually over time reduce the need for special education. So that'll be the metric, right? As we fund those kinds of things, that'll be one of the major metrics. Does it actually accomplish those goals and meet the need of the school? And every school is a little different in that regard.
And out of curiosity, when you track that,
yep.
Like I think an interesting data point would be not how many resources are getting IEPs, right? How much is being met by special ed, but how many parents are requesting that, and how many are getting it? Because I think there's so much effort, having been through this personally with my daughter, of resistance against that, and I get that from a budget.
Resistance against what?
Of getting money for supporting an IEP or a 504, and so I just, as you look at that data points, I just think it'd be really interesting to track not just the gap of kind of as you do intervention, are you seeing a shift in the costs go down of
Yeah.
support, which would be great, but also,
Well,
what's the gap of what people are asking for and what they're getting?
yeah, it's a good point. Let me come back to that metric, because that's a metric, the first piece of what you just said there at the end of your comment. Thank you so much. That's a piece people want us to track, and it actually doesn't work that way right now, right? So I got a question last night at a budget forum that was, so where are the savings? Where are the efficiencies that the school departments created that have saved money? And my very flip answer is eaten up by growth. That's where they are. So I'll give you an example of that. So we began a program in whatever year, 08, 07, associated with the dollars that we got from the federal government, the stimulus dollars. And we were to use those dollars to try to create programming that would then sustain itself over time. One of the things that we did is we went to the model of putting paraprofessionals in every full-time in every kindergarten and first grade. Now, we did that for a couple reasons. The main reason was that we'd studied the model nationally, and we knew that it reduced the number of paraprofessionals that would actually end up written into an IEP. It does, right? The model was actually supposed to go through second grade, but that's a whole other issue. And so that was the main reason. So here's the story. It has. That's happened here. And you wouldn't notice it in our data. And the reason is our number of paraprofessionals is essentially the same, right? Even though the percentage of kids on IEPs has dropped because our number of kids have grown. I mean, we've grown by 38% at the elementary level, right? So I would contend to you that you've seen savings, because what that number would have been without that intervention would have been quite striking. We've actually done that in special ed with a number of areas. And please, because the danger of this conversation of what I've said is that people say, great, they've tried to save money in special education. I believe we've tried to save money while improving program. I mean, we have more kids educated in Brookline today, right, that were in out-of-district placements 10 years ago than ever. Our number of out-of-district placements has dropped because we've built programming. And we've obviously built programming that for the most part people like, or else they'd be pushing us for those out-of-district placements. They're not. They're actually asking to come back to some of our programs, particularly at the high school. So we're really proud of that. That's where your efficiency, a word that on May 5th I'm going to stop using, have come. So thank you. Yeah, it's a good comment and a good question. But we've tried to put some of those into the hands of. What we're going to be developing over the next couple of weeks is actually being able. We did it once already. We have to adjust it now for our enrollment growth, is to show you what happens in year 2 and year 3, because those resources continue to come to the building level. Yes.
So I have a concern. So I'm for more taxes. I mean, the thought of not voting yes on May is just very worrying to me. And so one of my questions is I try to influence people and encourage them to vote and say yes and yes as many times on both questions. So you're talking about this visionary plan for, for the 2022 budget. And so as people are asking me questions and I'm trying to encourage them to say yes, how much is the question number 1 of our yes vote? Okay, so the second one is the debt exclusion, correct? And the first is just funding what we need at the moment.
Operating budget.
Yeah, so I feel like the next question someone's going to ask me is like, well, when's the next override then?
Yeah, they do. Right.
Yeah.
So let me say that. Oh, go ahead. You had something else you want to say?
No, not really. I just feel that I want to understand more. Maybe because I work part-time too, so maybe I'm just not reading enough. But I just don't understand. I want to understand more, like when's this next override coming? Because people are going to ask me as I'm encouraging them to say yes. And
I think you're reading plenty.
Yeah.
So let me just try. I mean, so first of all, let me just say something I should have said at the beginning, which is superintendents are in a funny position with respect to overrides, right? So I'm actually not allowed to advocate for an override. I'm not allowed to do that. I can be fined by the Election Commission, and some of my colleagues have been over time. So I'm particularly, I've pulled out my 08 speech again about how careful I need to be to just give you a factual answer, right? And there are people here, you can start with school committee members, who can talk more about those kind of campaign kind of issues. But what I can say is, I think it's one of the reasons that we put out a model of what it looked like through 2022 so that we could provide some of those discussion points, right? I mean, I will say that in that model, as you might predict even from the conversation here this morning, the majority of additions in the model at the high school come after 2019, right? And so, you know, again, with certain assumptions, right, there clearly could be need for additional operating revenue down the line. But what we don't know is where state aid is going to be, right? We don't know those things. This is based on a certain set of assumptions about state aid, health insurance costs, all those kinds of things. So we don't really know. What we know is what the need could be in isolation against a set of enrollment projections. But I'll give you another piece, right, that isn't in those models. People asked us to, and I said, well, then people are going to sort of hold us accountable for it, right? I gave a couple of examples here where we've started to build some ideas into this spending plan that we believe over time save dollars, or at least don't escalate the dollars as quickly as we've projected the model. The 5 positions we built in for response to intervention within buildings. Clearly, in districts that we've studied, in models that we've studied, they prevent, right, more students, in particular classifications of special education, from seeking IEPs, which cuts down on numbers of students in particular programs, out-of-district placements, all those kinds of things. So if we're able to continue to make reductions in those areas, right, then that adjusts the model. So I can give you pieces of the answer, which are that you know, this particular 3-year plan didn't take into account a lot of factors around what we project the need to be at the high school, but it also didn't take a lot of other factors into account as well. So I think it's, you know, one of the conversations we had at one time in this was, if you approached it in this way, come back to us in a year as we begin to see this, as we begin to see where state aid is going, where certain other assumptions are going in terms of health insurance, collective bargaining, all of those kinds of things, and we'll continue to make those adjustments, and we can continue to give you better answers. It's a great question.
The debt side.
Pardon?
The debt side. Overrides debt.
Right. So this debt, I think it's framed like this in the question. I haven't paid much attention to the framing of that question. Is in 2019, right? It actually is phrased that way?
No, but that's when it hit. It doesn't
That's
hit
when it
till year
hits.
4. It doesn't hit till year 4.
Right.
It hits tax bill.
Right. It hits tax bill in 2019. I mean, clearly there is going to be a high school solution that's going to be factored in sometime in these out years. You know, I still think there's discussion about what a 9 school, what that looks like in this, and what the timeline is on that. But yeah, those conversations have got to be narrowed down. We'd like them narrowed down. We just had this conversation yesterday. We'd like them narrowed down sooner rather than later, so that we can stop talking about 3 possible buckets and start talking about what our high school solution is and how we're going to get there. What our longer-term solution around the elementaries is. I mean, I know people, I go out for a forum next week, a budget forum in Baker, and people want to know what we're doing to address what now seems to be more of a certainty around Hancock Village and other pieces, and an enrollment that even without that continues to grow, right? What else? Yes?
So you mentioned the technology budget.
Yes.
That you like to think of more as a wiring budget, and I completely agree. Not all schools are equal. Sitting here in a new building, we know that when we go to other elementary schools. So getting access in the schools and at home is a priority, but then why mention or focus on the what you call the communication tool? If we successfully wire where everybody has access to the internet, why then focus on providing a communication tool between parents and teachers instead of focusing on using that money to provide better, deeper learning in the classroom, because we have means of actually accessing, those tools online?
So I think there's some of both. I focused on that because we have built some what we've referred to probably badly in the spending plan as administrative tools, right? An active learning management system, which our high school doesn't have, and most high-performing high schools do have that kind of access for their students and parents. What we have, unfortunately, because we haven't been able to approach this in the right way, what we have now is 10 different approaches depending on what teachers you have, and people who call me every week and say, why are these teachers on Blackboard or whatever, and this teacher isn't? My child can't access this there, but they can if they have this teacher. So we have this very disparate approach, which we don't like and aren't able to terribly support. I mean, I think there are a number of those pieces built in. I mean, one of our key challenges, as I said, is access, and access is going to mean at the high school level and the middle level, putting devices in kids' hands, right? My kids in Beverly, for 6 years of their education, have had devices put in their hands at the beginning of 9th grade. Every child has a device, right? And I can tell you, X number of years ago when I was a superintendent there, I was concerned about that. And I'm a believer. As a parent, I'm a believer. I've seen what's happened in terms of the enriching of that curriculum in each and every class, which was my concern, in each and every class at Beverly High School as a result of that initiative. And that's what we're trying to do here at our high school. We're blessed in that more children actually have access of their own, but not all. Not all. And that's true in 7th and 8th grade where we have the same. So I think we're actually trying to do both. If I highlighted one over another, I'm sorry, but I think we're actually trying to do both. But the bottom line is we can't do any of it until we actually close the gaps that I think you and I were sessions we talked about last year about the gap between our schools, which you'll see in that budget message, even in the 1 year of funding that we were able to devote to sort of the first year of implementation of that tech plan, we've closed dramatically. I mean, the gap was huge between the two outliers on the plan were Heath and Pierce, and it was huge, and it's been closed dramatically with a huge infusion at Pierce. We've focused we've focused classroom projection. I mean, we're sitting here talking about classroom projection, for goodness sake, in 2015, right? We've focused our efforts at the high school, and we'll continue to in next year's spending plan. And over the 5 years, we're able to put that classroom projection, outfit every classroom essentially the same. But I think if you take a look at that plan as we've described it in the budget message, I think it actually does both. Yep. Yeah, please.
And also at a building level, we are focusing on what teachers need to be able to use all of this technology to deepen it, and making the use of more formative assessment tools and enrollment to really target instruction more individually than we have necessarily been able to do in the past, and sharing best practices with one another. There have been a number of opportunities this year where teachers can learn from one another to do that. So I think each building's a little bit different in how they manage.
That's right.
The focus is.
Yes, sir. Sorry.
My name is Julius Sylvan. I'm first and fourth grader here, and I understand your question well about these resources. And what I feel is that, and I've talked with various parents, and there are many of us who think that it would be very good if our teacher had more resources when it comes to teaching topics around information technology, such as computer programming. At the moment, I'm teaching to my fourth grader computer programming at home, and it's not that tricky, and I don't have formal education for that. And I feel that their teachers have the capacity to teach them these subjects, and it's more matter of their education, additional education, teachers' additional education. Do you have any strategies for that?
As you're saying that, first of all, I agree that we need to be doing more with that, and I know we've been talking with Scott, I think you probably have as well, about that district-wide. Scott Moore, our director of information technology and or educational technology and libraries. And at the same time, so I'm not talking about surveys yet, right? But I keep hearkening back to my first reading of the district survey and seeing what teachers are saying about the number of things, the number of initiatives that are being put on them. And it's quite, I mean, our data isn't that terribly different than a lot of other districts, but it's quite striking in what teachers are saying about the number of state initiatives and local initiatives and kinds of things that we're saying. That we're going to have to figure that out, but I don't know how much of it is going to be able to rest with each and every classroom teacher, right? We're lucky to be staffed pretty well, even though we're talking about other areas where we think we need to be staffed better. It could be an area, and I think we've talked about it as an area that our educational technology people work with our classroom teachers around. But we haven't done as much as most. Burlington and some other areas are quite out in front on this area, and it's an area that we need to focus on. But I know conversations have started, and I can't give you a better answer than that this morning. But thank you for asking. Yep.
So coming from another public school system a couple of years ago.
Where?
I taught in Connecticut and
Uh-huh.
I lived in Indianapolis, Runkle area, Indiana. So my question is, I read about it in the tag sometimes, but what's the deal with Brookline? Like, I've never lived in a public school system where you don't have to pay a book fee. So a few $100s every year to help defer the cost of books and things. Like, I've just never lived anywhere that hasn't had that. And so to me, like, that's like alarm bells. We want to give kids a device. Well, if you were financially able to contribute this money, of course, for children or families that couldn't afford. I think the book fee for first grade 5 years ago in Carmel, Indiana, which is a very wealthy community, was like about $350 book fee, and it went up every year. And to me, that's a huge way to generate funds to help, put devices in people's hands and things like that. So
Yeah.
What's the deal with Brookline? Why is that?
Well,
discussed?
can I broaden your question a little bit and say what's the deal with Massachusetts? Because
Okay.
that's not a Brookline thing,
Okay.
right? There are some very poorly written pieces of the regulations, the education regulations, that do allow for small fees. But let me answer your question from the perspective of technology, which is how you just proposed it. And I'll start with the district I'm in, okay, where we do pay.
In Beverly.
Yes.
You're talking about the district.
The district I live in Beverly. I live in Beverly, and that program's been in place for about 8 years, 6-8 years, and we do pay, if able. Right? There's a way of seeing if people don't, and then the kids are, of course, provided with a device at no cost or reduced cost. But we do, and it's a very nice plan. It's essentially a lease purchase, is the way they've set it up. And at the end, for $1, I own it. I own this 4-year-old computer that my daughters have beaten to death. So that's the way that program works. There are a lot of districts that have done that. There are all kinds of approaches, right? There are approaches that say if you have a device, then that's great, and if you don't, we do it similarly to how Beverly does it, unless you can't afford it at all. And we've surveyed, and we know what the percentage of kids are at the high school, for example, who have access to a device. We asked the question very specifically: how many of you have access to a device that you could bring to school and use exclusively for you each and every day? And I forget what the percentage was on that, but we got a response, and I think it was around 70%, as I recall. And that's what we thought it would be. Some people thought it would be higher. It wasn't. And so we have this other part of the population to deal with on a program like that, and that's easy enough to deal with. Easy enough. There is some question so welcome to Massachusetts. There is some question in Massachusetts as to whether that's legal. There actually is a district by the initials Mendon Upton, where a parent whose child had access to a device has sued, saying, you give a device to her child, you need to give a device to my child, even though I can afford. That's discrimination. And the Department of Education right now is in the midst of trying to deal with that. Their initial opinions that they issued said that that parent was probably correct, and that would cause havoc with these programs across the state where we're trying to put technology into the hands of kids. So welcome to Massachusetts. And we'll have to deal, we have to deal with that. That you won't find, I don't think you will, I don't know of anyone, I don't think you'll find, and the law is rather iffy on this, the regulations are rather iffy, I don't think you'd find book fees that I know of in the Commonwealth, regular book fees. We do have a fee program for employees who don't reside in Brookline to bring their children here, and they have to pay something called a materials fee because tuition is not legal. It's not legal for us to take in students under tuition. So they have to pay a fee that essentially is designed to cover the materials that their child uses, but even that's been deemed iffy by some legal people, I should say. How'd I dance around that one, okay? What else? Yes?
What is an active learning management program?
So, yeah, I probably said that wrong. So a learning management system essentially allows students to interact with teachers around assignments, those kinds of things, allows parents to access information. My son went to St. John's Prep on the North Shore. When he was there, they had a learning management system, so I had to go to the parent session on what we shouldn't use it for. We shouldn't use it to monitor all their grades. People did anyhow. Yeah. So, but it allows that kind of communication and access. Those that we've looked at allow you, your child, I'm talking about high school now, to be active managers of your graduation requirements. So you don't have to rely, you obviously have as much access to a guidance counselor as you have now, but you don't have to rely on that. If you want to take a look at these are the graduation requirements and this is where I'm plotting against them, it's there. It's on you. So it's a communication device. It allows students to schedule. It allows you to interact with teachers and administration, all in one sort of Blackboard environment. And it allows our teachers to do the same. Again, what we've looked at for teachers allows them to manage their email, their educator evaluation, their professional development, all within this Blackboard environment. So it's that, and we pay a subscription fee for it. It's not the biggest part of this, but quite frankly, as we've surveyed high school parents, it is one of the areas that we get the most feedback on, is they want that ability to interact and don't feel that they have it now, or that they have it sporadically now. Yes?
So you've been speaking about and educating us for a long time about the growth in the double-digit growth in enrollment. I'm just curious, has there been an impact on the growth in enrollment and the fears around the overcrowding and the renovations and the issues with some of the schools in high school? And has there been a change in attrition? Are you seeing, I know in my daughter's class a lot of kids who moved on to private school, and I'm just curious if you've been monitoring that.
We have, and district-wide the answer is no. And again, this conversation all the time, but every school is different, right? Every school is different in terms of a number of characteristics. I mean, I say, you've probably heard me say here and in other places that we know that between 3rd and 8th grade, that the faces in a classroom are about 60%, district-wide, about 60% the same. And I've had people at this school and at Heath say, well, that's not true, right? And I believe you. Here it probably isn't. And at Devotion and Lawrence and a couple of other schools, it's higher, which is why it's 60% district-wide. Same thing on that question. I'm asked all the time, have you seen some changing patterns, for example, into 6th through 8th grade? People told me forever, if we see any attrition, that's where it's tended to be, middle grades, right? And the answer district-wide is no. We monitor the private school numbers. They're essentially the same. Last year, there was a little bit of a hullabaloo about the fact that we saw some drops in 4th through 8th grade that we hadn't seen before. First of all, they were almost all associated with Devotion, which was entirely predictable because they're about to undergo a renovation, and we know that happens. It happened here, it happened at Lawrence, it happens everywhere, right? And then they come back with friends when we come back to the school. Happens every time. right? And so, but I go to Heath, and people will say, well, those numbers are larger here, and I say, I believe you, I know that they are, and yet they're smaller than their school. So no, district-wide, we've not seen that. I mean, I've shared with people that I've been concerned about that the last 2 years. I think some of the conversation, some of the tone of the conversation the last 2 years in the people I encounter has people more worried, has people more concerned, has people considering options that I don't think their predecessors were considering 3 to 5 years ago. And I worry about that, but the numbers keep coming and the numbers keep rising. By the way, just so we get the numbers right, because I don't want to be 38% growth at the elementary level. District-wide, when you factor in the high school, it's 25% growth, which is outrageous, right? Because the growth hasn't actually hit the high school yet. So when you factor that across, that's 25% growth K to 12, 38% across the elementary levels. And some people have said at these forums, when does that level off? And I've said, I don't know, tell me when it tops out. Because remember, 6 or 8 years ago, I stood here and I talked about growth. And what were we talking about? 550. We called that growth. And now we're sitting here in 2 of the last 3 years, we're at 680 or above. That's a different kind of growth. So tell me when it tops out, and then I'll tell you when it levels off. How about that? We'll make that deal.
I was just wondering, is that 38% year over year, or is it over the last 5 years?
38% since 2005.
No.
Thank you. 38% since 2005.
Because
We're-
25 over year.
Yeah. That would be Arlington, Virginia. I have a colleague there. We had this conversation. He said, well, we have 25% growth. I said, wow, well, we have this. He said, per year. I said, oh, it's...
Somebody always has work,
Thanks.
right?
Thanks. Yes.
I'm looking through my notes, and can you go over again what happens? Because you said you would talk about no override in your visionary budget, but you haven't said if we don't get this override, what happens next year? Like what's happening? Can you just go over that?
Ken, thank you. 2 or 3 main points in that. I mean, we've focused on, we still do some of those areas. We do much less of them. The literacy specialists happen, but the math specialists and other kinds of enrollment-driven supports don't. And even at that, we're left with about a $1.2 million shortfall. And so we close that shortfall in 6 ways. One is we reduce our support for Medco by consolidating the 4 positions that we have across the 8 elementary schools into 2. The second is we cut the professional development budget, and the third is we cut the materials and supply budgets, which I think we make the case would be really not very smart things to do. But again, we were trying to keep adults in classrooms, particularly at the primary level. We eliminate the ECS program. Again, I think that's one of the areas where these 2 budgets, I think, really where things really stand out. In one, you're looking at what I think is a terrific set of enhancements to the program, and in the other, the program is eliminated. The high school, we eliminate 5 positions. And what I know, I can't tell you what they are, because we still have that work to do with the headmaster. Here's what I know. They will either raise class size, eliminate electives, or eliminate supports, like tutorial, or all 3. That's a fact, they will. There's no way around that. Because you can't do it just by eliminating support positions. It doesn't work that way. At the elementary level, we eliminate 5 positions. So I didn't say this earlier, but you'd look at the budget, you say, well, I don't understand, because over here you added 3 positions in classrooms at the elementary level, and now over here you're eliminating 5. Why don't you just say eliminate 2? Well, because we wanted to be clear, we wanted to be transparent. The 3 that we're adding are in the primary grades. We maintain class sizes in the primary grades. Where class sizes will go up in the no override scenario is at the intermediate and middle level, grades 4 through 8. So here's the exercise we're involved in right now with principals. We did it yesterday. Monday. So we're in the process of identifying the candidates for those consolidations. And the main criteria that gets you into the discussion is that the classes would go to somewhere in the range of 26 to 29, because that's what they'll be. Beyond that, we're looking at a number of other factors. Numbers of ELL, numbers of special education, numbers of free and reduced lunch, teaching experience of the people in that grade level. You know, if I've got 4 second-year teachers, I'm probably not going to consolidate that, right? So we're looking at these characteristics, none of which are good, but all of which will drive us. We have 14 grade levels in schools that we've identified. And now we're in the process of looking at the criteria around them to narrow it down to 5 to 7. Now I know people want to know that now. So do I. So do they. They really want to know. The reason the principals really want to know is we've got this whole hiring exercise to go through. So, you know, this complicates things. This whole fact that we don't know our budget till after May 5th complicates things because we actually have to plan for 2 budgets. So at the same time we're saying, well, we might consolidate a section in 4th grade here, we're saying, what are we going to do if we're adding sections over here, or if we're adding literacy staff over here? And that's very complicating because we have to plan for where people might go, right? If we bump an ECS teacher because that program's eliminated and that person's professional status, they're owed a job. And so that's probably going to be by their license in a section, in an elementary classroom somewhere. So we have to plan for where they might go in that budget versus where they would go and who we might hire in the other budget. So it will delay hiring. I mean, that's a major concern of mine. I mean, Vanessa can probably talk much more specifically to what that feels like at the building level. I know they weren't happy in that discussion on Monday. I think that would be putting it lightly, with having to deal with all of this uncertainty, but that's our lives right now for the next couple of months. But those would be the reductions, and that as I said, that would drive those classes to 26 to 29 at grade 4 through 8. Yes,
I think so. All of that information is in the budget message. If you didn't catch it was going through, but I think there's just sort of another level of answer that we talk about at the school committee level, which is, you know, if you go back to the override study committee findings, unanimously, the override study committee, after a year of study, said there's no fat in the budget, there's no inefficiency, there's no waste, and so you're really operating. But all of these needs are growth driven, and so if you think about that as the starting point, and you say, you know, if these needs are truly growth driven, they're not some wish list of amazing, you know, platinum technology, then what that means, and everybody agreed unanimously on the override study committee that an override was needed. And so I think if you start there and then you say, you know what, we're a great system in the sense that we've got really good achievement overall, but that achievement's kind of leveled off as we've looked at this growth. We're not seeing the continuous upward trend in student achievement, even just by MCAS scores, which are one measure, not the only thing, but it's one thing. And we're not seeing the closing of achievement gaps. So if you kind of say that that's where we've been, and yes, the system has good bones, but like there's a tremendous amount of stress on it, this is going to make that tremendously worse. If you think about what does it mean to not have additional supports for classroom teachers, you're putting more and more burden on classroom teachers. You're putting more kids in the classrooms. You're giving them fewer supports outside the classrooms. You're giving them fewer math specialists. There's less differentiation. There's less, just less and less and less and less. And so I think that, yes, there are good bones here, but there's just this chipping away if you kind of look at the trajectory of excellence. And we're not only are we not going to be kind of back up, we're going to go down, right? Because there's no other way to do it.
Right.
And so I think what's really challenging from a school committee point of view is that as we see these long-term trends and we see, there's already been, there's kind of a strange conversation about needs versus wants. Maybe we don't need all of this money, but then you look at what the original budget projection was. There's already $2.5 million that we cut off of that budget projection in terms of programs and services, and that's what this number is. This number is already a compromise. And so the idea that some people want to fail it or not, this isn't really the time to do this because there are other times to have this conversation, but just the consequence is real. And it's real for kids, it's real for teachers, it's real for the community, and I feel like that's the piece that isn't quite getting into the conversation yet, and needs to.
Thanks. Yep.
So help me put
I can do one or two
You
more.
mentioned hiring. My concern is, about, in addition to what you said, Susan, is are we seeing or are we concerned about the quality of the applicants coming into the district? So Brookline for a long time has been viewed as like the holy grail of public school districts.
One of them.
And
Yeah.
having a very high bar
Yep.
to set as who we are, attracting and we're hiring. Are we seeing any trends or concerns about, being able to still
No,
demand that level?
so simple, quick answer is no, not now. I mean, this process with the override study committee went on for some time, and we discussed often concerns. I've added to that list of concerns since. Right, I worry about these kinds of conversations. Number one, I worry about conversations about compensation and the collective bargaining agreement. I think we do need to do more analysis of our collective bargaining agreements against other school systems. I quite frankly am not terribly impressed with conversations about our collective bargaining agreement against other collective bargaining agreements in town, because I don't know anybody that comes in and says, I can't decide if I want to be a police officer or a school teacher, right? It's about, do I want to teach in Lexington? Do I want to teach in Newton? Do I want to teach in Brookline? I think there's a whole array of things that enter that. I mean, we're in a pretty interesting conversation, for example, with the transportation board about parking, right? And parking is a consideration for us that my colleague in Lexington doesn't need to worry about when he recruits teachers. His teachers get a parking lot at their schools, and we don't. And we tell people in some schools that they have to walk 4 blocks to get to the school, or we say, why don't you take public transportation? See how that worked out for us. There are so I worry about, I worry a lot, right? But I worry about those kinds of things as well. To date, no. And it's something I think we have to constantly monitor in terms of those working conditions, in terms of being able to get, and we look at it against being able to get the people we want. We talk often about it with principals. We haven't seen a real compromise in our ability to get the people that we want. There are a number of factors that we continue to need to monitor. I mean, our teachers have said, particularly our teachers coming on over the last 4 or 5 years, have said things like the materials fee program are very important to them. Things like access to daycare for their children, like the Staff Children's Center that's housed up at Baldwin, make their working conditions better, make it easier for them to choose to come to Brookline. That's why I advocate for those things, because they're part of that package you asked about. Anyone else? Yes.
Can you say anything about any impact on elementary world language budget-wise?
Yeah, I can. So thank you. What simple answer is, I said to the school committee, and then I'll sort of give you the detail of this answer, that the elementary world language program, by our calculations of a year 2 of an FY17 budget, is eliminated in FY17. Okay, and here now I'll go back and tell you why, and why we didn't put it in the FY16 budget for elimination. So it has everything to do with retention of people, right? Some questions that have been asked. So, sorry, a little inside baseball, 2 seconds of inside baseball. Elementary world language people are licensed in world language. They generally are not licensed elementary teachers, which means if I say, look, if this doesn't end up being our budget 2 months from now, your job's eliminated. They don't say, well, that's okay, because I can bump over here. I can bump into this open 2nd grade classroom. They start looking. And there we know of districts that are starting programs. So they're going to look. So we could, as I said to the school committee, we could be sitting here on May 6th saying, hooray, look at all these new revenues that are available to us. And oh, by the way, folks, we lost 8 of our world language teachers. So we lost by winning, right? So that isn't the case with ECS and some other areas. They tend to be licensed in other things. So we said 2 things. First of all, we did a back of the envelope calculation on what we think the shortfall is for next year. We believe it's at least in the 1.2 to 1.3 million shortfall range. that would mean the elementary world language program. So in an effort to make sure people didn't leave on us this year, right, we actually built it into the second year, the beginnings of the second year, no override projection. That's why. It was all about making sure that on the 6th of May, we still had a program. So we were trying to think a little bit more long term, which is what I think people would want us to do. So thanks for that. All right? Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
I had read in the paper, I think that instrumental music was also on this thing.
Not part of this package.
So it's going to continue.
Not part of the package for FY16. Again,
Oh.
back of the envelope calculation on 17 and 18. The assumptions we've been asked to use by the school committee is that there's no override, and there's no override coming in June, and there's no override coming next year. There's no override. So begin to think about what that looks like over 1, 2, 3, 5 years. So clearly there are significant shortfalls in each of those years, and something will go, class size programs, all those kinds of things. So when we get to those budgets, those things will all be part of the conversation. But nothing in FY16, and again, as far as I've sort of dipped my toe into the water on 17, is world language. Thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. Thanks. All right.